300 million, and it doesn't show signs of slowing down in the near future. When the Population Commission was created originally, there were suggestions for slowing down, for having a population policy in the United States, and that never happened. And since it never happened, it's safe to say that if you don't have a population policy, you have established a policy, and that is for uncontrolled growth.
In the third part of our series, we handle a very tough question. Why did the U.S. environmental movement back away from its early position on immigration and U.S. population? Here's one explanation of how that happened. The overwhelmingly non-Hispanic white leadership of the environmental movement may have felt it was defensible to address population growth as long as the great bulk of population growth came from non-Hispanic whites. This was the case during the early years of the baby boom. In fact, the environmental movement is often remembered as starting around population issues. But the situation changed dramatically after 1972. From that year forward, the fertility of non-Hispanic whites fell below replacement level, while that of African Americans and other communities of color kept rising. So even raising the issue of fertility reduction after 1972 drew disproportionate attention to non-whites.
America has had a very unhappy chapter in it in terms of racism and discrimination. And I think in 1960s, it was such a glorious chapter in American history that it sort of imprinted itself on us, and we passed essentially not only a bunch of civil rights laws, but also the immigration law of 1965, which in fact changed the whole flow of immigration from sort of the developed world or Europe into opening it up.
That left the predominantly white environmental movement in the position of opposing mass migration, made up predominantly of immigrants of color. I asked National Council of La Raza leader Janet Nergia if it was possible to oppose immigration on environmental grounds without being charged with racism.
I think reasonable minds can differ on how we deal with the issue of global climate change or of immigration reform. And, you know, NCLR has been an organization that's been around for 40 years. And we've worked with Congress and we've worked with members on both sides of the aisle, and we can have honest policy differences, and it shouldn't have to at all question someone's openness to race or ethnicity.
The fact that the immigrants are coming from different countries than they did prior to, say, 1970 creates a volatility in the immigration debate and makes it easy for opponents of any immigration controls to argue that those who want to limit the numbers are motivated by racial animus. It's a very predictable kind of argument to make. The fact is the sheer numbers have grown so much larger than anything ever seen before in American history, means that we ought to be able to have a responsible debate about numbers without getting into thorny issues like that.
During the 26 years after 1972, the non-Hispanic white share of population growth declined significantly. Thus, by the 1990s, a majority of the nation's growth stemmed from sources other than non-Hispanic whites, mainly Asia and Latin America. Environmental leaders, proud and protective of their claim to the moral high ground, did not want to address volatile race and ethnic relations by appearing to point fingers at persons of color.
I do think that the religious community and the Hispanic caucus and the very fear that people have, the real fear of being charged as being racists, I think has just put immigration into a very difficult category of public policy. It's very difficult to discuss immigration without somebody coming up and saying that you're a racist.
Pro-immigration is more of a human rights stand, and it became the reactionary forces were the ones who were sort of, no immigrants, close the borders, build fences. So part of that was over the immigration issue more than anything else, and in a change in stance.
Meanwhile, modifications in immigration law launched in 1965 inadvertently started what is referred to as chain migration, in which immigrants acted as sponsors for extended family members. Chain migration began to snowball during the 1970s. At the very time that American fertility fell to replacement level, immigration levels were rising rapidly and swelling U.S. population. This was a boon to the business community, which benefited from the new labor pool.
Cheap labor is a great economic boon to the business community. Cheap labor is economic cocaine to the business community. They get addicted to it.
In 1970, I think it's safe to say that probably only about 5 to 10% of our growth was due to immigration, which at the time was running about 200 to 250,000 per year. By 1990 or 2000, that had completely changed. In any given year, only about 1/3 of the growth in the United States population was due to the birth rate here of the native-born, and about 2/3 was due to direct immigration and the indirect effects of immigration, which are births to immigrants, which over the long term just basically prevent the United States from ever stabilizing its population.
Rapid U.S. population growth was making it ever more politically and technically infeasible to meet environmental goals set in the 1970s. Yet the environmental movement of the late 1990s was willing to forsake its original goals and newer ones to protect a level of immigration that was 4 times higher than it was before the first Earth Day. What was it about immigration that made environmental groups, by and large, meekly acquiesce to immigration levels that clashed head-on with the fundamental goal of population stabilization?
The environmental movement became much more of a left-wing movement than it had been. And the more that the conservatives sort of shunned the environmentalists, the more the environmental groups became leftist, and the leftists overall saw immigration as a racial issue.
And hence, we are on a course to hit 1 billion people sometime late in this century, with devastating consequences for our environment. If we even get there, I'm not certain that the United States will be able to support 1 billion people when you consider things like peak oil, climate change, but that's the trajectory we're on right now. And environmentalists, by and large, the environmental establishment, the major mainstream groups are virtually doing nothing to try and raise concern about it or do anything about it.
We hope you enjoyed this special edition of To the Contrary. Next week, how women are surviving the Great Recession. Please join us on the web for To the Contrary Extra. And whether your views are in agreement or to the contrary, please join us next time.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by
designed to function the way you function.